Well, everybody has been talking about the pretty significant shift that has been taking place within the electorate, specifically around young men and how far and how fast they appear to be moving to the right. But the question is, why? And everyone kind of thinks they know, but here's what I've seen so much of, especially within the academic classes, within the political classes. I will watch a room full of people with men in their 50s and 60s and women sitting around a table discussing why young men are doing what they're doing. And the idea that any of them would actually ask young men is apparently absurd to them, because young men are supposed to sit down, shut up, and do as they're told, right? And that seems to be the attitude that they've had. So we wanted to do something different. We said, all right, great, let's go talk to some young men within our community, and let's ask them why they believe young men are moving to the right. And we weren't going for just I was raised that way, or just, I'm just kind of naturally, more on the right because I'm more conservative. What? No, we want to know, like, what specifically do you think, have you experienced with your friends that you think does a good job of explaining why so many young men are going to the right now? And I'm going to read off some of the responses we got. So one response was this: 20 years of watching girls and young women make very short-sighted, bad decisions, humanly possible, and then gaslight each other about it, calling it progress or empowerment, while getting a free ride from many of the consequences of those bad decisions at our direct expense, while we get absolutely nothing in return. The left offers me, a white Christian straight male, nothing, while giving everyone else freebies in direct proportion to how little they are like me, and makes me pay for it one way or another. Or here was another one. When a young man was asked, why do you see this happen? He goes, each gender has a natural inclination to certain characteristics because of how we are created. It's ingrained in men to be protectors and leaders. For a long time now, men have been told that those traits are toxic or oppressing, and men have become tired of listening to the party that says their nature is evil and wrong, and are taking back their personal responsibility. There is a clear distinction between what the left says about men and what the right does. There is only one option for a man who actually wants to be a man. And we've actually seen this being spoken. I mean, who was it? Was it Eric Weinstein or Brett? I think it was Eric. He was on Chris's show, and they were asking the question of what young men are doing and what's going on. And he said, well, yeah, what other option did the left give them? And I think it's important to understand that so many of the conversations and the things that we've seen, and some of the numbers that we're going to go over, when you watch the left describe what's going on, they come up with 1,000 explanations, none of which include that maybe the way they have treated men, the way they have talked to men, has any impact on the way young men feel about their positions and their political party. But the thing is okay, has the left not been honest? As the left, is this just bad marketing, or is this an honest reflection of where the modern left currently is? And I think one of the greatest explanations for why young men are actually starting to shift to the right is Good Ranchers. Because if you are eating sufficient amounts of steak, ladies and gentlemen, it's hard to stay a little commie. It really is. How are you going to stay a leftist when you are eating some of the most delicioso beef, pork, poultry, and wild-caught seafood in the country? And that's exactly what Good Ranchers provides. In fact, Good Ranchers offers 100%, read it off here, American source meat, free from antibiotics, added hormones, and seed oils. Right? Not to mention the fact that if you actually sign up, if you go on right now and you use promo code Nick, you go to Good Ranchers, use promo code Nick, and you subscribe to any Good Ranchers box, you're going to get your choice of free bacon, ground beef, seed oil-free chicken nuggets, or salmon in every order for a year. And on top of that, just because they love you so much, they're going to give you an additional $40 off your first order. So goodranchers.com, promo code Nick, go get all of that. And I'm telling you right now, as somebody that we eat a lot of Good Ranchers, it is wonderful. It is really, really good. And they're a fantastic company. So you get to feel good about eating more meat, about supporting a great company, and supporting our podcast. Goodranchers.com, promo code Nick, go check it out. All right, Christian. As a young man yourself, I'm not a young man anymore.
Not so young anymore.
Not as young. You're still in the younger spectrum. I'm definitely in the middle-aged, quickly closing in on getting AARP, advertisements sent to my house. I mean, you asked some of those questions and got some of those responses. And I remember when you read them off as we were kind of talking about this initially, it was, again, it was incredible to see what young men had to say in their own words about why they think this is a problem. So what are some other information that we're actually seeing?
So, on that front, there's a famous quote by Napoleon where he said that during revolutionary times, never trust a man over 40. They will simply not be able to grasp the situation. And to some degree, there's some truth to that. I do think it's possible. I mean, because you're a little bit over 40, I do think it's possible for people over 40 to grasp this situation. I just don't think that they'll get it immediately.
Yeah.
The way that the under 40 crowd will. And when you speak to like 20-something-year-olds, let alone like teenagers that are increasingly on the right, there is really this like reality that everything is being marshaled against you.
Yeah.
Like all the forces of society, all the institutions, the Leviathan, everything that we've talked about, like they all have one enemy, and it's them. They've declared them to be the enemy. And it just so happens that we now live in a time where electorally that group is now responding in kind.
Yeah.
So there was this tweet that I put out, I guess like maybe a week ago, that Elon caught on. So of course the notifications just blew up. It got 14 million views. And it points out something really interesting, that 20-year-old white men in the United States are now more right-wing than 75-year-old white men.
Yeah, which is crazy.
That is insane. If you
I can tell you right now, every single, it used to be like the common actionable knowledge was always when it came to like election time and whatnot, we had to go get, our voters would always show up because they were older voters and they would just consistently vote in every election. But that was the dynamic. If they were 60 and older, we just automatically assumed for the most part they were probably going to be, odds are they were Republican voters. And that's not the case anymore.
Historically, the way that the GOP would campaign is you would have an election. The GOP would just bank their votes on their guaranteed 60-plus base that many cases were wealthy or highly educated. And so they didn't really have to do anything to get them to vote. And the GOP would instead spend the entire election cycle on persuasion.
Yeah.
And then they would simply hope that the Democrats wouldn't drag their voters to the polls, because if everybody went out and voted, we would lose because we just physically didn't have as many voters as them. We now live in a completely inverted world where we're the silent majority, which carries with it all the problems of being the silent majority.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, we are the majority. And the coalitions have totally shifted where, again, like if you were to tell me 10 years ago when I was 20 that the most conservative demographic in the entire country is 20-year-old white guys, I wouldn't believe you. I'd be like, no, of course it's the 55 to 65.
Well, that's because back then that is what it was. See, that's the thing is the millennials didn't do this trend. It's the Zoomers now. And so if somebody asked you that when you were young, you would say no way, because it really wasn't the case at that time in that generation. But this new generation coming up, and that's why you see like the shift up. Like if you just take these people 10 years down, that's what we were used to, right? In our generations. And so
the 30 to 40 crowd is much more liberal than the 20 to 30 crowd.
Yeah.
And I'm going to go through and explain this chart because it's actually really hard to read. I don't know why they did it this way, but go ahead though before I.
Well, no, I was just going to say, the most significant part about this for me is that it's minority men are now, majority. It's
under 20 for them
too.
Under
20. Like, so if you're a minority man, under 20, you are less likely to support. I mean, you're under 50% now for Democrat support. Like Trump won the under 20
men of all groups.
Yeah, men of all groups.
Now that doesn't mean literally all groups. He still lost black voters under 20.
Yeah.
But we're talking about as a whole, non-white voters under 20. So that's Asians and Hispanics and stuff like that.
Yeah.
He won a majority of them, but he also, obviously, he won an overwhelming majority of 20-year-old white men. That was the crazy thing is that the most Republican demographic in the entire country, you would traditionally think is that 55 to 75-year-old boomer crowd that watches Fox News.
First of all, let me fix this real quick because 55 is Gen X, all the way up to 60.
Boomer is a state of mind, Tina.
Okay, but you need to stop using terminology that's not true.
Okay,
hold on.
10 years ago,
okay,
you
no,
could say that they were boomers.
Let me just put everybody back on track, because here's the thing is we always do this thing where we lock ourselves into these numbers, but it's a moving thing because people age. And so anybody between like 45 and 60 is Gen X. 61 to like something like 78 or something like that is boomer.
Yeah.
So
okay, the point, fair point taken, but
which is why when you see the 50 to 60s, the upper 40s to 50s and 60s, you see us being super conservative.
So the point that I was trying to get across though is that we typically think that the most Republican group is the 55 to 75-year-old man that watches Fox News. And that is not the environment we live in anymore. The most Republican group in the entire country are white men under the age of 25.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there is this interview from the New York Times. I want to play a little bit of this. It might be like a minute or two, and then I want your guys' response to it, because it's actually worth it. And they break down this chart because it was a Democrat pollster that did this. So here's what Ezra Klein had to say in an interview with a Democrat pollster. And I just realized it's all muted. Give me 1 second. Let's see. Oh, that's the problem. Okay, I've got it fixed.
Got it. All right.
Hard to read. So can you describe to me what's happening here?
Sure. So we have 4 lines on this chart, and the x-axis is age, and the y-axis is our estimate for what fraction of people in that group voted for Kamala Harris in 2024. And, we have a light blue line for women of color. We have a dark blue dash line for men of color. We have like a light pink solid line for white women, and then a dash line for white men. And one of the things you can see here is if you just look at 18-year-olds, 18-year-old women of color are the only of the 4 that actually, voted that Harris won. Trump narrowly won, non-white men.
So I do find this part of this chart shocking. I sometimes talk about narrative violations, and I think if we knew anything about Donald Trump 8 years ago, it's that young people did not like him.
Right.
And Republicans are maybe throwing away young people for generations in order to run up their margins among seniors. But if you look at this chart among white men who were 75 years old, supported Kamala Harris at a significantly higher rate than white men who are 20 years old.
That's exactly right.
That's a real shift.
It is a real shift. This is the thing I am the most shocked by, I think, in the last 4 years, is that young people have gone from being the most progressive generation since the baby boomers, and maybe in some ways more so, to becoming potentially the most conservative, generation that we've experienced, maybe in 50 to 60 years. And so, the next chart, just...
So,
I mean, these charts do go up and down, and I think some of what you see is the generation following one extreme will go the other direction, because the natural inclination of the younger generation is to rebel against some of the things the older generation is putting on them. And so you do see this flex up and down. It's just a lot more extreme now.
Hang on, I think Tina, you jumped ahead. We're still trying to explain the problem, not what's driving.
Well, I know. But what I was just trying to say is this is not a new phenomenon to see it kind of flex up and down.
No, I think this is a new let's put it like this. I don't think, going back to that Napoleon quote, I don't think that the typical Republican in their 40s or 50s or 60s understands quite how conservative might not even be the correct term.
Yeah.
Understands quite how on the right the 20-something-year-old male Zoomer is.
Well,
it would probably stun them if they actually had them in a room and they asked them some straight up questions about policy and they got answers back. It might actually dawn on them that these kids actually are more conservative than I am.
But I feel like it's in direct relation to how oppressive the previous generation's demands were, and how far they're going to rebel against them. And so that's why I think you're just seeing this really extreme thing, because the millennials have been they've gone completely off their rocker. I mean, they are the boomers of that younger crowd. And so they have just taken all of this. I hate using the word progressive because it is not progress, it's regressive, but they've taken it hook, line, and sinker along with all of the rules attached to it.
Well, I think here's the thing I would throw out there is that, for as long as I can remember, it was the Winston Churchill quote, right? Where if you're young and not a liberal, you have no heart. If you're old and not a conservative, you have no brain. And the whole idea behind that was that when you are younger and you are looking at problems and you are looking at potential solutions, there's this tendency to look at things from the lens of like kind of heavy on altruism, like, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if only this or if only that? And then what happens is you get a little bit older, you start to recognize that, well, no, there's a lot of time, work, and effort that has to go into all of this, and there's a lot of second and third order effects. And then you start realizing that, some of your friends that talked about, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if, never really wanted to do any actual work to make those things happen, but then they wanted to target you when you did do work. And so what it was is the more kind of mobility that you saw within society, especially economic mobility, the more people realize that, oh, there is a pathway to being able to achieve things. And a lot of the things that I was maybe lamenting about when I was young, I didn't understand, everything that went involved into poverty or war or everything else. I didn't understand those concepts. And as I became more acquainted with the world at the same time that when I worked hard and I achieved, greater economic benefits and stuff like that, I saw that there really was an accessible pathway. And a lot of the people complaining just didn't want to put in the work along that accessible path. And now they want to take my stuff, right? This is the funny thing where it's like, oh yeah, you're real liberal in college, and then you start paying taxes and you start becoming more conservative.
Yeah.
But what we're seeing right now, I think is different.
I don't think it's fiscal, and it's partially fiscal.
It's partially fiscal.
But can I just say, like, in the past, you would see the dogma of one generation being rejected by the next generation. And
everybody does the kids these days.
Right.
Thing.
They do. And so
notice how it was always rejected to the left.
Okay. Not necessarily always, because Gen X ended up a lot more conservative than the boomers. And so
I always feel like
we're the most conservative. If you take the 20-year-olds out of it, or 21, 22-year-olds out of it, we're still the most conservative. It's just this new generation. And so my thought is that this is almost a religious problem, because the left has created this religion with a ton of dogma and a ton of rules.
Well, again, you're getting into the why.
I don't want to get into the speculation just yet. I still want to explain the phenomenon, because trust me, we're going to have a lot of time to talk about what's driving this, because there's a lot that's driving it. And I think you hinted at some stuff that I don't think people fully appreciate, that it's not entirely fiscal. But Nick, you were about to say something on the front of like, well, traditionally we had this conception that it was, like you said, the Churchill quote. Yeah. But that obviously is starting to change, because by Churchill's own definition, we have a whole bunch of people that apparently have no heart.
Yeah. Well, and it was just, and again, I think to most of us, it made sense, right? If you can see things in the world that you think should be changed or whatnot, it's really easy to be like, oh, well, if only people were better, if only government programs existed, if only, and it becomes very easy to fall into that until you realize who's got to pay for it, and you realize the inefficiencies and everything else. But now we see a generation in like middle school and high school going, screw that. And it's like, whoa, okay, that, I mean, that's going to require more of an explanation. But we just showed like a couple of charts. Like, we've got some other data here, because people also come to the conclusion that, oh, this is a phenomenon in America. And it's like, well, no, we're seeing this everywhere.
Yeah. So on that front, to blitz through just some stuff real quick. I know we've briefly talked about this as well on your point about, high schoolers. We've brought this up before, so I'm not going to go through it. But the headline is that the headline is that 12th grade boys are becoming more conservative as girls trend overwhelmingly liberal. So that's one of the other things as well, that this is not across all demographic brackets. This is specifically a growing gender divide that's happening to the 20-something-year-old and teenage crowd right now. And on that front, though, there's some really crazy stuff happening all over the world. So I want to go through this really quickly here. This was from last year, right before the EU elections that we covered.
Yeah.
If it was just up to Gen Z,
is this for the for EU? Okay, EU.
What would have happened is that the quote unquote far right party in Belgium would have won in a landslide. That's just one example in Belgium. So here's the breakdown. This was women. Oh, look at this. They're all voting for the Green Party, right?
Yeah.
But look at men.
Yeah.
They're voting for the Flemish nationalists in Belgium. And then look at the difference with millennials.
Yeah.
They're way more moderate with millennials, right? They're voting for the more center-right party. The men are, and the women are just...
We saw the same thing.
The women are just nuts in Belgium. And if you scroll down here, in Germany, here's something interesting. Here's the breakdown. So like in 2022, they're all voting for the Greens, right? In 2023, they're still voting for the Greens. But look at what happens last year.
That they went from
plurality.
Young men went from 14 to 29-year-olds surveyed, right? Ended up shifting from the Greens to Alternative for Germany. Like that's the most,
and they don't have good press. Like AFD is, I think it's unfair, but AFD is maligned as like a Nazi fascist part. Like they have the worst PR in the world.
To give you an idea of the whole situation with AFD, the current parties in Germany have tried to get AFD banned, like legally not allowed to be a political party. And they've done so in somewhat with like at least tacit support from like the Christian Democrats, which are considered kind of like they're more like moderate Republican Party would probably be a good definition for them.
That's a huge shift going from the Greens to AFD. It's not like they're going from the Greens to the Free Democrats.
Yeah, which is more the
kind of the Libertarian Party.
Yeah.
And then if you scroll down here, here's another example. Here's Finland. Here's the distribution of Finland's youngest voters. So this is 18 to 44-year-olds. Again, women are just, they've gone crazy. They're voting for the Social Democrats. They're voting for the left. They're voting for the Greens. But look at the men.
Yeah.
No, they're voting for the nationalists, like the hardcore Finnish nationalists in Finland. And then look at the boomer crowd.
Because men long for the wars.
Look at the boomer crowd. It's just a complete, like
the socialists.
The 65 plus men are voting for the Social Democrats and the center-right party. Whereas the 18 to 44-year-olds are like, nope, we're voting for the hardcore Finnish national. Like, and again, it's just insane when you look at the gender divide too. That's the important thing to focus on is the age and the gender divide. I'm going to keep, actually, I think that's it.
Can I ask a question, Christian?
Mm-hmm.
How much do you think the birth rates play into whether or not they're going to have the power to actually do anything with it though? Because we have an aging population, that is, so the younger generations, like nobody seems to be making it for the what do you call that? Replacement rate.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so you still got an aging population that is just a bulk of the people.
That's the whole reason the right hasn't completely taken over all these countries in Europe is because the right's voters, here's another example. Here's Portugal. 18 to 34-year-old. They're voting for Chega, which is the quote unquote far right party. I actually looked at their platform and it's like not far right, it's just right.
Yeah.
But I mean overwhelmingly, right? And then they're voting for the center right.
That's another thing to keep in mind is whenever the Europeans describe a party as far right, understand sometimes that's an appropriate designation for them. More often than not, if you look at what they're saying as far right, it's just a right-wing party.
Yeah.
It's just a party that generally believes.
Sometimes it's like an actual nationalist party.
Yeah.
Like if you're in Hungary and you're on the far right, you probably want to conquer Transylvania from the Romanians. But like largely, this is simply, we don't want mass migration. We don't want social services going to non-citizens. We don't want the destruction of traditional social values. Like
they value property rights and free markets
it's
for the
actually
most part.
Like,
even then, it's
if we were in a lot of these countries, we would likely be voting for the far right parties in most of these cases. But like again, here's another example in Portugal, 18 to 34. They're overwhelmingly for the far right and the center right. And then you look at the boomer crowd.
Yeah.
And they're all voting for the Social Democrats. Yeah. They're all voting for the socialists because of the pensions.
Yes. Yes. That's exactly what it is.
And you get this is in France. Look at this.
Yeah.
18 to 25-year-olds in France. A third of them are voting for the National Rally.
And to give you an idea.
And Le Pen was just convicted of a crime. It was a total sham trial. What happened where that's a whole nother story for another time. But like, she was just convicted and now is going to be barred from running for office and might be sent to prison for a complete sham trial involving apparently like money laundering between different staffers, of like taking money for one staffer and then giving it to staffers who are involved in campaign activities. And it was a total sham trial. She should not have been convicted of this, but it's really an attempt to stop her from being able to run again, because polling shows now, she's done this 3 times now, or twice now. Polling now shows that like, if the next election was to happen, not only would she make the runoff like she's done before, but like she would actually win.
Well, and here's the thing to understand about National Rally, because again, I want to be intellectually honest about this. National Rally is a party that has a very checkered past. Like
they're definitely a far right party.
Yeah. Now, well, and here's the deal: is like they have actually moderated pretty significantly. If you look at what National Rally used to be, 40 years ago or whatnot. I mean,
they were a quasi-fascist
party, and they've moderated significantly into being what I would call more of a nationalist party, and that's a distinction, right? Like a fascist party is not just nationalist or militaristic. A fascist political party typically is very left wing when it comes to their economic policy.
I was going to say that National Rally like 40 years ago was more fascist economically as well. They were more corporatist, they were more state controlled, and they have moderated, and we say this in a good way. They have moderated on economics. They've become, I wouldn't say that they're like a libertarian party. They've become more open to property rights and what we would call a more free market conception of things. Again, I'm not trying to pretend that they're a libertarian party, but no, they've moderated and become just more of a nationalist party over time, which is part of the reason they've grown. But again, look at so 18 to 25-year-olds are like, no, I'm voting for National Rally. But then when you look at like, well, the interesting thing is that men and women seem to be on the same page. But again, women are still more on.
Well, the interesting thing, too, with some of these European countries, the ones that like, so you see this in France, you see this in Germany, you're starting to see it in the UK, although it's much slower there. So the women within the country who are liberal, the liberal trend is still taking place. But the women that are going conservative are going very conservative. They're not going. They're not doing this. Oh, well, I think I'll vote for right of center in my local elections, right? That is not what's going on. A lot of them are women that actually live. Some of them live in urban areas and they don't feel safe on their streets anymore. They absolutely see the mass importation of young men from countries which have very, very different views with respect to male and female relationships. They're seeing that and they're like, And I'll tell you what, I think it was for some of them too, is they were probably more on the left side of the spectrum, because when 70% of your peers are on one side of the spectrum, it's really, really hard to push back against that. And you generally don't see that women usually rally more than, men might have more internal fights or differences. Women generally rally around a particular approach, just generally speaking. But when you're in an environment where now you've been followed home or you've been assaulted or and then you go back and you say, I can't believe this happened to me. And people look at you and be like, you need to be quiet about what happened, because that's going to stigmatize immigrants. And it's like, you're more concerned about the potential stigmatization of the mass importation of young men from a country that apparently seem to think it's okay to do this to women than you are about the fact that I was assaulted. Like, that's what, and that is causing a lot of young women to be like, oh, screw you.
But here's the thing, though. There's not nearly enough of them that are moving to the right. There's one more chart that I want to go through from this, and it'll be quicker to illustrate what's happened.
We've experienced maybe in 50 to 60 years. And so, the next chart, just to describe
this chart in some ways convinced me to do this podcast.
Oh, thank you.
This chart shocks me.
I agree. This is, to me, the scariest chart in this entire presentation. And again, something I'm very surprised by. On the bottom, we have age. And at the top, we have the gender gap in support between women and men. And, for support for Kamala Harris. And so what you can see is that, for voters over 30, the gender gap was fairly stable at around 10%, which is roughly where it's been in American politics.
And voters over 75, it's even lower.
That's right.
It's a fairly low gender gap among older voters.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people, underestimate how recent the gender gap is. Historically, Republicans did better with women than men. And, this was true across most of the West, that center-left parties did better with men than women. And, that's changed in the United States in the Clinton era. But, it's been stable since then. But what's crazy is if you look at people who are under the age of 30, the gender gap has exploded. If you look at 18-year-olds, 18-year-old men were 23 percentage points more likely to support, Donald Trump than 18-year-old women, which is just completely unprecedented in American politics.
Is that
Okay, I want to say something here because this goes to what Tina was saying earlier, because this is really important. It's, again, that gender component is why we're kind of dedicating this episode to specifically asking young men why. But I think the other thing that needs to be understood here is that typically what we've expected, what like Winston Churchill talks about, is that it's everybody kind of starts over here more center left. And then as they go throughout life, people tend to become more conservative. That's the general trend. Not everybody, but that's the trend. You start off more liberal, you get more conservative over time as you experience more life. Here's what I think is actually going to happen now is like when we you could look at that last chart and you could say, oh, okay, well, yeah, the under 25s feel this way and you have this big gender gap or you have this big difference between, but over time, what'll happen is that gender gap will start to go away because look at the chart, right? That's what we see. The gender gap goes away no, what you're going to see is the left part of that graph, I think is not going to continue perfectly, but it's going to start to continue throughout when they 25, 30, 45, 50, you're going to start to see, an increase in that. Now, the question will be is that sustainable over the long run? And I don't think it is. Like this is where you get in a crisis point, because when you have young men and young women at this point, we're not talking about casual disagreements about tax rates. We're talking about significant disagreements about the nature of reality.
Yeah, you had women divorcing their husbands for voting for Trump.
Which, I mean, divorce
and if
is
you're
horrible,
in the 20-something crowd, you're not even getting married, which is a whole nother conversation. But like, here's another source from the Brookings Institute, which is a center-left outlet.
Group.
When it comes to party identification, Democrats have lost significant ground with young men. In 2020, 42% of young men in Harvard's poll identified as Democrat versus 20% who identified as Republican. Pretty terrible numbers for us.
Yeah.
Now, 32% are Democrats and 29% are Republicans. And this was actually, I think, about a year old, this survey. It's only moved further to the right. So we went from a 22% deficit to statistically tied with that crowd. That's a huge, enormous shift. We got the same thing here with Newsweek. I'm not going to go through the whole article, but this is covering that podcast that we just went through a couple clips
Can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
Is this really the same crowd, though?
What do you mean?
Because when they polled these people in 2020, they have now shifted up, and that it's a new crowd.
Yeah, that's the whole thing.
Exactly.
It's newer voters that are entering.
So it's not that the same people have moved. It's that age demographic has moved and they've shifted. So what we're getting is we're scooping in more of the younger people are aging into this crowd and the older people are aging out of it. And so it's not necessarily the same actual people. It's just the same age group.
So to put it like this, in 2016, I was in that 18 to 30-year-old the youngest voting demographic, right? I was like 22 or 21. Now it's crazy. I'm now entering the middle voting demographic, the 30 to 45 or whatever demographic. And so I've aged out of that youngest bracket. And meanwhile, there's a whole new generation, the Zoomers, because I'm the last of the millennials. I'm a zillennial.
So the
Zoomers are now entering in, and they're much more to the right than my generation.
And it's not done yet, because you've got the younger people that are going to move up into that bracket and probably even change it more the next time it's polled.
Yeah, because when we get into the whole why is all of this happening, we're going to have to address some of this, because again, what we're seeing right now is actually three things. One, older generations, which we usually banked on to get more conservative over time, didn't.
in some ways they got bluer. They got more progressive.
Yeah, which again goes against, kind of bucks the trend that we kind of associate with this, maturation process over time and experience and, owning property and things like that. 2, younger people, younger men are getting significantly more conservative very early on in life, at the same time that younger women are getting significantly more liberal earlier on in life. And so those 3 things all together are I think laying the groundwork for something very, very different.
We're entering a totally new political era than the one that any of us are used to. And we just need to chuck out the old traditional thinking of how politics is operated, because luckily I'm young enough that it might not have been totally solidified in my mind, but like I was saying earlier, like the vast majority of people have this conception of this is how politics works. This is the Republican coalition. This is the Democratic coalition. If you're a Republican, you need to start getting used to, especially if you're a Republican working in politics, you need to start getting used to the idea that your core base might be a 20-something-year-old men's crowd. Well, and that's just historically unprecedented for any of us.
Well, we increasingly saw Pennsylvania was in part an example of the reason why Pennsylvania was one in part is because we treated the election cycle significantly different than the way we had in the past. That's where you saw things like Cliff Maloney and Justin Grice doing the PA chase. It's where you saw guys like Joe Desolé working up there. They started chasing after voters in a way that typically Republicans have not had to. We just, our base just reliably showed up. And these were the guys that were saying, that's not the world anymore. We have to, our voters are there. We got to go get them though.
Yeah.
And because they put in the effort to do just that, they got them. And then you saw in the special elections in Pennsylvania, when they didn't do that, they got crushed. And all of a sudden, Democrats were winning seats in the Pennsylvania Senate. Like, how? And people are like, oh, it's a backlash against Trump. It's like, okay, the way those backlashes tend to work is whoever has the base of the most reliable voters are the ones that show up in special elections. If you've got to chase your voters and you're not chasing them, you lose special elections.
Can I just bring up one other side of that particular one is that one of the areas was Lancaster, which has a very high Amish community.
Yeah.
The Amish came out and voted for Trump, but they normally don't vote. So they're not voting this time around.
Yeah.
Yes,
and they made a big difference too.
But to get us back on track, though, because as much as I would I would love to talk about Pennsylvania voting demographics all day long. But this is a podcast that, quite frankly, I really want to hone in on what is driving
the
young men to the right, because quite frankly, I think too many people look at this just analytically from a third person outside perspective rather than thinking about what's actually happening to these guys. Because quite frankly, most of the people talking about this conversation they're older than us.
Yeah.
They're usually data analysts or politicos in their 50s and 60s that are talking about the young people these days. Like, just put yourself in the mindset of these guys that are growing up in a world where everything has been inverted and they're just demonized and villainized. Like, to give you an idea, feminism, which has just been rammed down the American people's throats for a whole, I mean, I would argue certainly my entire lifetime, arguably Nick and Tina's entire lifetime. It's been upheld as this like principle to aspire to. We need to make everybody a feminist. Well, the polling here shows that Gen Z men are no more feminist than Gen X men.
Yeah.
And in fact, they're actually regressing. I would say that they're moving in the right direction, but they're regressing compared to millennial men. A majority of, and this from 2023, by the way, so this is a little bit older data, but a majority of millennial men 2 years ago identified as feminists. Only 43% of Gen Z men are.
Yeah.
This is a prime example. And look at the women here.
Yeah.
They're falling off a cliff in the sense that they're all becoming indoctrinated into this. And then their male counterparts in that same generation are like, no, I'm not a feminist. My older brother, 5-10-year-old older brother might be, but I'm not.
Yeah.
Think about that.
This is why I bring up the dogma. I feel that feminism and some of these progressive ideas are cult-like. It's basically a cult. And people, I feel like when the dogma doesn't attack you, you have no reason to leave it. But when the dogma attacks you, you're going to start shying away from it. And so that's one of the reasons why women are totally fine with it, because it favors them. And
men were fine with it until it started explicitly discriminating against them.
It's not, I would say this. I would go further. It's more than just discrimination. I would call it abuse. And the reason I call it abuse is because it's been this psychological attack on men, and also even at a physical level, even because the school systems and everything are set up to favor girls and the way girls learn, and boys have been forced to have to operate in ways that are not conducive to male thinking and male bodies and what they need. And so it's basically like an abuse of neglect. And so one thing I just want to throw out there, it's been rolling around in my head, is the fact that when you look at, this is going to sound crazy, but when you look at criminals like serial killers and people who have brutally attacked other people, the common denominator is almost always an abusive mother. Almost always it's a neglectful or abusive mother. Well, the state has become the mother now, and it has abused and neglected its young men. And I feel that you're going to see men go one of two ways, because it's just like with an abusive or neglectful mother, because it's a feminized society. So our society is now the mother, and it is going to cause men to either rebel and defend or become a monster.
Tina just loves jumping ahead today.
Yeah.
Did I jump ahead?
Way ahead. Way ahead.
We're now just entering the why are they doing it. She was already on the why are they doing this like 20 minutes ago.
Yeah.
And now that we're just entering the why are they doing this, she's now jumping into, so where are they going to go from here? Your point is well taken, though.
No, I was just trying to show the similarity between abuse, the society abusing men, and mothers abusing men, and where that can lead.
So I do think it was either you or Nick who said on a podcast several months ago that boys are treated like defective girls in the educational system.
Yeah.
And I think that you're seeing evidence of this in some of the polling. So here's a chilling statistic for you. In 2019, less than 1/3 of men under 30 felt society discriminates against men. By 2023, close to 45% of young men said they experienced some or a lot of gender-based discrimination. That and look at the other ages here, 30 to 49, 50 and older. 30 to 50 and older, it fell.
Yeah.
30 to 49, it grew a little bit. And again, that might be people aging into older aging brackets. But again, like the Zoomers here, this is an entirely Zoomer crowd, 18 to 29-year-olds. By the time you get to 2023, it's almost half of young men.
Yeah.
Think that they're facing some or a lot of gender-based discrimination against themselves.
No wonder so many men want to become women now.
I think one of the things that really hit the nail on the head of this for me culturally was a video by Shoe on Head. Now, Shoe on Head, and you're the one that showed it to me. Shoe on Head used to be a definitely left of center, and she would comment on things, political, cultural, relationships, things of that nature. And there was a couple things that happened where now they consider her to be right of center. But
which is funny because she's still a populist.
yeah. It's not as it's not as if she's running around quoting Thomas Sowell, Milton Friedman, and stuff like that. But what ended up happening, she did this one video on Are Men Okay? So keep in mind, this is a young woman, I think she was in her 20s, that was doing, again, a variety of cultural videos, all from all favoring the left-wing perspective.
That was a few years ago, right?
Left-wing perspective of reality. And then she does one on Are Men Okay? Are young men okay? And like you see this light switch come on because she ended up having to do a response video specifically to the comments that she got in her video, where she was honestly just saying, I'm looking at everything that is going on and young men don't seem to be okay. And the response I got from women was basically, who cares, or good. Like, and
it wasn't like one or two comments.
No, it was hundred. Like they were flooding her page on like unfollow, because how dare you ask the question, are young men okay? But I think there's something specific going on.
If you haven't seen that video, by the way, you're listening, go watch it. It's it's one of her top performing videos of all time. Go ahead though, Nick.
But there's another component to this that I think is really important, and this is where you see this difference taking place. young men are looking around and going, wait a second. There's women-owned small business economic set-asides. There's special scholarships for women. There's special, everything for women. There's all kinds of different seminars and approaches and grants and everything about women, and nothing for like a man, unless you're a minority man. Then it's, minority-owned small businesses or minority scholarships or whatever it is. He goes, but if you're a straight white man, there's nothing for you. And in fact, despite the fact that you're paying a lot of the taxes to make all of these other things possible, you're evil, you're bad. And if you have any questions or any concerns, sit down, shut up, and we're glad. Now, here's the deal. I think most young men, and we see this throughout history, right? If we were growing up in a time where they really did see these massive disparities between men and women, whether it's like being able to get into college or things like that, they would probably come to the conclusion that, oh yeah, there's some work we've got to do in order to ensure, greater equal protection before the law. Because as I like to remind people, women didn't get equal protection from the law by themselves. Men helped them out with that because we were the ones that could vote when that was going on. Okay, so now you have a generation of young women, and this is the part that I think really makes men upset. They're looking at it going, wait a second, you guys have won. Everything. You've won everything, right? You've got the subsidies, you've got the set-asides, you've got the praise, you've got everything. And it wasn't good enough for you to have all of these things you now have to dump on me consistently. And it's like, I think they would almost get it if it was like, if I was talking to an 80-year-old suffragette, right? Which at this point would be a 100-year-old suffragette, right, who was explaining the frustration that they experienced at that time about not being able to vote. I think a young man would look at me like, yeah, I understand that. That makes sense to me.
Maybe not anymore.
But now it's like, wait a second. You don't get to claim that you're somehow horribly oppressed and that I'm the one doing the oppressing. And yet, if you were to talk, let's say you were to talk to an 80-year-old woman that actually lived through those times, she would be nicer to you than a 20-year-old woman that lived through none of it.
Absolutely.
Oh, it's
none
true.
Of it.
The older women love you because of the masculinity. Older women love masculinity.
And so that's the part that I noticed this. I would talk to people on the civil rights side where they had grown up with some really difficult stuff. Like, you want to talk about genuine institutionalized racism. They are old enough to remember Jim Crow. They're old enough to remember when they couldn't drink out of a water fountain because of the color of their skin. You talk to them and you listen to them talk about the civil rights movement and things today. They're nice. They're polite. I mean, not everybody, but like, they're like, oh yeah, no, we went through a lot. There's been a lot of changes. It's great to see all this progress and the whole deal. And they don't treat you like you are individually responsible for it because of your skin color. But you talk to their grandkids. Oh my gosh, you're a vile, evil, horrible, slave-owning oppressor. And I'm watching this trend about how the more victories that were established within these things, the more progress that was made. And I'm talking genuine progress. Genuine progress. Jim Crow is horrible and evil and vile, and I'm glad it's gone. But it's like, okay, where's the dividend with respect to the way that, where's the acknowledgement that, oh my gosh, look at all this wonderful progress we've made? It's not there within the left because it can't be.
There's no money to be made in solutions.
Well, and the left has to keep us all in this constant state of you're either being oppressed or you're about to be oppressed unless you're giving us all of the power that we insist on having.
The grift requires it.
Yeah.
On that point, according to this same article, in 2016, 61% of women reported being satisfied with the way women were treated in the U.S. But today, only 44% are.
Yeah.
Did America just become way worse off for women between 2016 and 2023?
Honestly,
it's that mentality that you just brought up that, like, you could talk to, I mean, they're gone today, but like, if you could bring a suffragette from 1900 back today, she would treat young men far kinder.
Yeah.
Than the 23-year-old female in a university
that had to go through
her
none of
peers.
the things that the 100-year-old suffragette had.
And on that point, this is also kind of chilling. Nearly 1 in 4 Gen Z men say they've experienced discrimination or were subject to mistreatment simply because they are men. At a This is a far greater rate than for older men. Like, the idea that you would have like just open misandry, like almost institutionalized misandry. Not even almost. Not even almost. Institutionalized. I remember when I was in the university system 10 years ago, feeling like that men were discriminated against, especially white men were discriminated against. I can't even imagine what it's like today to be an 18-year-old white guy, especially if you think about it, an 18-year-old straight white Christian guy going into a secular liberal university. I mean, you are public enemy number one the second you walk into those doors, basically.
Well, and what's interesting is that whenever a young white man now says, like, look, I think I'm being discriminated against, like, how dare you? I'm sorry, were you held in slavery? He goes, I'm not talking about slavery. I'm talking about the actual use of the word discrimination. And oh, by the way, were you held in slavery? I'm okay. You have the right. You've always had the right to vote. So have you. So have you. Like, that's where it is. It's looking at young women. It's like, you have not gone through the same trials as your forebearers, and yet you've got a worse attitude about reality, the future, me, and everything else. Like, wasn't there supposed to be a victory at some point? And the answer to that, I think, in many cases is yes, and there would have been, except for leftism hijacked these movements. Right? Leftism decided to hijack movements associated with women's rights, associated with civil rights, associated with a lot of these things, and decided to take something that needed to happen in many cases and then converted it into a leftist objective. And the leftist objective, as we've said before, is the issue is never the issue. The issue is always the revolution. But you're seeing this now, especially, even though like young men of color are being like, no, this is not what we signed up for. But women across the board, especially young women of color, they are absolutely on board with this idea that, oh my gosh, like absolute oppression is ever present in their lives and you're responsible for it. It's like, is it fair to point out that if you were really living in a society as draconian, patriarchal, and oppressive as you think, you probably wouldn't have entire college courses dedicated to it, and you standing up there and saying, oh, look how oppressed I am. Right? Like, I don't recall many other periods in human history where somebody was as brutally oppressed as you think you are, that were as vocal and as loud, with all of the government apparatus, all of the educational apparatus, all of the Hollywood apparatus supporting you.
Julius Caesar didn't set up DEI programs for the Gauls.
Yeah.
On that front, I do think that there's something to be said about how the long march through the institutions is driving a lot of young men to the right, because they're not marching anymore. It's over. The long march through the institutions has been completed.
Yeah.
There's nothing left for them to march through. And when you think about like the narrative that's pushed out there, it is basically, you must repent for your sins. That's what wokeism is, except there is no, there is no Christ Savior, especially if you're a young white man. It's just perpetual guilt. You're offered the perpetual HR department. And so what you're seeing in response to this, and it's only natural, is that institutional trust is just disintegrating.
Yeah.
But it's disintegrating with the younger crowd, and specifically with younger men, more than any other age group. The ones that are running the institutions, the boomers, right? Or the or even like liberal members of Gen X or millennials that are now entering into leadership positions within these institutions, they're not losing trust in them. It's the youngest crowd that's losing trust in them. For example, hang on.
Okay.
For example, only 41% of Gen Z says that they have trust in the university system.
Yeah.
That is something like 20 or 30 points lower than other generations. And although this isn't broken down by gender, I guarantee you that Gen Z men have a much lower level of institutional trust in the university system than Gen Z women, when you consider the fact that there's more Gen Z women that are in universities than men in the first place.
And more women running all of these institutions. I mean, from cradle to grave, women outnumber men in the education apparatus.
Here's another example that's just going to stun you. This is from Sargon of Akkad, Carl Benjamin, who brought up a recent Daily Mail story. Schools to give boys anti-misogyny lessons to stop toxic masculinity in wake of Netflix hit Adolescence. And Carl says, remember this, their greatest fear is that the young men of England reject the system which is oppressing them and politically organize to reclaim their birthright. If you are an Englishman, pay attention. What they do reveals what their weaknesses are.
Yeah.
What's your reaction to this?
Well, and don't quote me on this because I'm not looking it up right now, but I believe Adolescence, they had a movie that Netflix did, and it was loosely based on this stabbing that took place. The difference is the actual stabbing that took place was an immigrant man that was in the UK that stabbed a young girl, and then they switched it out to be a radicalized young white English boy who stabbed like a young girl or his sister or something like that because, what misogyny. And again, this is one of those things where anti-misogyny lessons to stop toxic masculinity. The more they try to do stuff like this and the more flagrant it becomes obvious. Like they used to just be able to get away with it and they can't get away with it anymore. And it's driving them nuts. And their answer is to become more and more draconian in their approach. But one of the big differences between the left's approach in this era versus previous eras is that in previous eras, the left didn't denigrate masculinity. Now they have.
Yeah. They've declared open. I mean, they have ruthlessly, and I mean ruthlessly, applied the friend-enemy distinction in a way that has never existed as it relates to gender dynamics.
Yeah.
Like, there is this narrative that if you were a man, you were bad. And that narrative is coming exclusively from the left. And it's especially if you're a younger man, you are bad. Especially if you're a younger white man.
Yeah.
And so then when you look at these like voting trends, like we're stunned by this.
Well, you're saying
in
it's
some
coming
ways
from
it's
the
like,
left.
of course.
Yeah.
Of course, if you're a 20-year-old white man, you're going to be a Republican in the United States voting for Donald Trump. Who on earth hates themselves so much that you would even consider voting for a party that just quite frankly despises you and despises you for things that are completely outside of your control? They don't despise you because of how you act. They say that.
Yeah.
They say it's because of toxic masculinity or whatever. No, they hate you because you're a white man who's in his 20s. That's the reason they hate you. It's not because of your actions. It's because of your identity. And so when one side forces a label and plays an identity politics game and wields a friend-enemy distinction against you, what's inevitably going to happen over time is that identity will become crystallized in a group of people that have never previously thought of them as I am X. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I don't think that 20-something-year-old white guys viewed themselves as, I'm a 20-something-year-old white guy. That's my identity.
Yeah.
And I'm going to carry that into forming a political identity. Most 20-something-year-old white guys back in the 1990s or early 2000s were just like, I'm John.
Yeah.
They never viewed themselves as a group identity. But when you have a political side, the left, attacking you for immutable characteristics and being very explicit about it.
Yeah.
And doing it for an entire generation, it's almost like the sword is being thrust into your hand and you're being dragged into the battlefield and you don't have a choice but to defend yourself.
Yeah.
And so like this rise of identity politics on the right, some people talk about like the woke right, which is a whole nother conversation that we might need to have one day. But like the rise of right-wing identity politics, a lot of these guys didn't choose that fight.
No.
They're simply they're responding to, it's a defense mechanism against a group, the left, that have decided to explicitly attack them for the crime of existence.
Yeah, for immutable characteristics they have no control over and for a history they had no part in actually creating.
Yes.
And like to your point, more and more the left is it's really becoming rather than the left against men, it's women against men because women are comprising themselves. They are in the left, in massive numbers. So it's really women oppressing men now.
Well, and
I mean if you look at the numbers, the education system before college, it's 77% female teachers.
Yeah.
So you're in an overly feminized environment with an overly, not feminized, but an overly feminine education or workforce.
That's why
teaching.
I say the state becomes the mother.
And an overly feminine student body, because universities are something usually 60-40 or sometimes even 2-to-1 female within the university system, and it's only gotten more lopsided over the last generation. If you go back like 30-40 years, the universities were overwhelmingly male. They were overwhelmingly female when I was getting my undergrad.
Yeah.
It's only gotten more lopsided since then.
And it's also trending more female in the professors as well, and administrators.
I love, too, how Axios describes all of this. Share of Americans age 18 to 29 who identify as liberal. Women, 40%. Men, 25%.
And then they're like, what's wrong with the men?
And then, yes, you go down to why it matters. Men affected by many of the same societal forces, early exposure to smartphones and social media, and a toxic political culture aren't budging. It is never them, right? It's never leftism.
Yeah, but I'm glad they're doing it this way because
I get it.
They're losing ground.
Yeah, it's just more young women also now identify as liberal, 40% than moderate, 37%. Young men are slightly more likely to identify as conservative than liberal, with moderate 44 as the largest share. And I guarantee you some of that moderate is like if I'm answering a survey, I'm giving whatever I think the safest answer is. But this is the part where we look at like, okay, the data is in, like this is happening. When we talk about why it's happening, the left wants to completely ignore any sort of part that they've played in this. And you know what? God bless them, because I want them to completely miss the ball on this one, because I don't think they're capable of correcting in such a way which would allow them to be introspective at all about leftism as an ideology. And all they will change is the marketing. Like that's the biggest concern I have right now is if leftists were really willing to consider that, hey, maybe leftism is the problem, then I would want them to be able to look at this data and properly analyze it. But no, they come to the conclusion, no, the problem is that anybody thinks differently, or the problem is that young men are actually getting to speak for themselves when really they should just be regurgitating whatever we've told them because we've already decided what the right course of action is. And it's like, okay, if leftists refuse to understand the fundamental problems of leftism, then I don't want them to become better at marketing, right? And that's what they're going to try to do. Like I've warned about this before. I said, look, the good news is I think those who are so dedicated to left, they've so bought into it that it's almost impossible for them to step back and look at this objectively and recognize that maybe they've got a problem on their hands. You have other people that are more interested in holding power than they are dogmatic adherents to leftism. That's your Gavin Newsoms, right? That's increasingly people like your Ezra Kleins. That's some other people within the left that understand that if they ever want to hold political power again, they can't do it at the complete and total expense of young men. But if they took power tomorrow, does that mean they'd be like, oh, well, what can we do to address some of these concerns? No. It's what can we do to make it appear like we're addressing these concerns while at the same time pushing our agenda as far to the left as we possibly can, but this time with the support of young men.
I don't think it's going to work, though.
I think they've gone too far.
They've crossed the Rubicon. The moment that white man went from being a descriptor to an insult that the left would hurl against somebody to shut down debate, which they started doing that, arguably 10 years ago.
Yeah.
In some ways, they set in motion a series of events that have led us to this point. And quite frankly, if you're a 20-something-year-old guy, and we talked about how it's actually all age groups, or not all age groups, all racial groups, right?
Yeah,
because
there was a question about that. They said, do we see this gender divide across ethnicities?
Oh, yes. Yeah, it's just that all the other ethnic groups are more left-wing as a whole, but you see it with Hispanics and with Black.
Well, it's growing. You did not see this break. You did not see this gender gap between Black men and Black women, or Hispanic men and Hispanic women.
And now there is one.
And it's significant.
But right? it's only with that 18 to 25 crowd.
The younger crowd. Yeah.
Like, for example, I believe Trump won the 18 to 25-year-old Hispanic men crowd outright.
Yeah.
Like, first Republican arguably in modern polling history to have done that. But he lost, that same group with women overwhelmingly. Because again, you're getting this gender divide emerge with all racial groups. It's just that one of the biggest and most prominent ones is with whites, because whites are the largest part of the population, but also because, quite frankly, the most Republican group out of all of them are the 18 to 20-something-year-old white men, because they have the additional attack front that the left hits them on, which is their race. The left also hates black men and Hispanic men for the crime of being men.
Yeah.
Yes.
But they will lavish praise on them insofar as it's a useful tool from identity politics if they can leverage the racial aspect to their benefit.
Yeah.
But
So
with white
basically,
men, there's no out. There's no they will provide no
You got to
avenue
become
for
trans.
you have to become literally like you have to they provide no escape valve for you to avoid being attacked unless you jump into another protected class, which is LGBTQ whatever. If you're in, there's like 20 something characters if you're in Canada. But,
well, and the moment you fit into one of those categories, and this is important to understand, the moment you fit into one of those categories and you don't loyally repeat leftist dogma, you're now a traitor, and all of the protections that the left told you existed because of your sexual identification, because of your race, because of your gender, because of whatever other category they put up. Now that instantly goes away. Why? Is it because you became less gay? Is it because you became less black? Is it because you became less of a woman? No. You violated the sacred agreement with the left. And that is, you only get the protections that we've assigned you based off of your immutable characteristics if you agree with us politically on everything.
If you're a true believer.
And we will tell you who is oppressed and who is an oppressor. And if you don't fall perfectly in line with that, then we don't care about these other characteristics. Like I saw that firsthand when I watched a black female delegate tell a black male delegate, well, you're not kinfolk, you're skin folk. Whoa. Why? Is it because he's less black? Is it because he has less of a black experience? Is it because his family didn't go through things? No, it was because he disagreed with her on a political policy. And that is what made you kinfolk, right? This is so important to understand, is that all of this other stuff that they throw out there is so important. No, it isn't. Adherence to left-wing ideology is the single most important thing they believe in. And that became so evident to me when a black Republican was not allowed to join the House of Delegates Black Caucus, but non-black leftists were allowed to join it.
That's because it's a religion. The whole thing is a cult. Now, it's not a set of values. It's not issues based. It's a cult. And if you're not a true believer, it doesn't matter how many demographic boxes you check off. Then you're not a true believer, so therefore you're ostracized and
all of the grievances,
and also abused.
All of the grievance that would have been initially assigned to you based off of all of those characteristics are instantly voided the moment you're not a.
So I want to look at what's happened with young men, because it's in some ways it's really depressing, and I think this is driving partially some of the politics, because they have no champion and they're just the punching bag of society in the name of tearing down, hierarchical, patriarchal, white power structures, right? They're the ones that just nobody champions them. They're always attacked by these institutions. Nobody ever defends them. And I think there's other factors behind it as well, but like some of these statistics here are just downright depressing, but they have to be covered. When you look at things like friendship, young men are more likely to be living at home. They're less likely to go to college than women. They're significantly less likely to be employed than older generations. They completely lag behind when it comes to forming friendships. 63% of young men aged 18 to 29 are single. 2/3 are single. 2/3 of the group that should be getting married and having kids are single. Only 34% of women in that same age group identify as single. Young men are more likely to, an absolute majority of young men say that that their friend groups are only with other men. Whereas for women, that's not the case, right? If you keep going down here, most of them just spend their time playing video games. I mean, 2/3 of them, right? And I'm not attacking that. I love video games too, but like they're just sitting at home. They're not going out and interacting with the rest of the world. They're not making friendship. Like
we have this interesting dynamic that's taking place here that is also, I think, somewhat unique to our current time, and that is when you have a culture that tells men, we don't like you, we hate you, you're stupid. Unless you agree to repeat this dogma that we've assigned you, then we don't want you to have any part of society. Well, once upon a time, it was a lot more, there were a lot more reasons why you would go out and you would fight against that. But now, with the rise of, cheap dopamine hits, right? It's never been easier to be able to get some sense of community or some sense of sexual gratification, right? It's not the genuine article. It's a little bit fake, but it feels realer than anything you're going to get out in a culture that says that they hate you. And so now young men actually have outlets that they didn't possess, 10 or 20 years ago. I remember, I'm old enough to remember where if you wanted to play a video game, you at least had to go to the arcade, right? That's not the case anymore. You've got better consoles sitting at home than I ever had growing up in really, really expensive, arcades and things of that nature. The other thing that I think is highly detrimental to young men is the access to pornography.
So, what's really interesting? I was just trying to find this. What's really interesting, in some ways, this might seem like a good thing, but if you actually think about what's probably driving it, it's actually a sign of it. It's just really interesting. Pornography use for young men has actually dropped from the millennial crowd. So this chart shows that the number of men in their 30s and 40s that are likely to watch pornography in the past month, past year, more than a year ago, or never. 30 to 49, it's 57% in the past month. But 18 to 29, it's only 44%.
Christian,
so what's interesting...
Do you think it aligns with the more conservative, though?
No, what it is, it's young men that are shutting down entirely. They're not even bothering to watch porn. Or, the same thing is happening with drinking. So millennials drink. Zoomers, they don't drink. And so you might think, oh, they're teetotaling, conservatives, they don't drink, they don't watch porn. What it is, they're shutting down. And so historically, if you were shutting down from society and you were cutting off, you would go into pornography, you'd go into alcohol, you'd go into drugs, you would kind of self-destruct in that way. Well, now we're seeing a different type of self-destructing with young Zoomer men. They're not even bothering to get the dopamine hit in the form of watching porn or drinking or taking drugs. They're not even doing that.
Are you sure they're not just getting their dopamine hit from video games?
Well, they are doing that, but do you get where I'm going?
Yes.
There was a.
I was just wondering what data you have to support it being them shutting down and not just moving to the right or getting more.
Let's put it this way.
Virtuous.
I wish I could remember the name of the person who said this, but there was this speech that was given maybe about a year ago. And it was a guy on the left who I disagree with a lot. It might have been Scott Galloway, actually, who I really don't like. But on this one point, he brings up something interesting where he was like, when I was a kid, my parents would, be concerned if I stayed out too late, right? And now I look at my kids and I'm like, well, you don't get into enough trouble. You don't go out at all. You don't hide things from your parents at all. You don't do anything. You're sedentary. You're shutting down. And so we had this idea 20 years ago that no, it's a dangerous thing if kids hide certain things from their parents or they stay out too late or something like that, or they get in with the wrong crowd. But then you look at that same age group now, these teenagers and young 20-something-year-olds now, and they're not even doing the historically risky or dangerous things that would be a form of rebellion against their parents that could have serious negative consequences. And so in some ways we can look at that and say, oh, that's a positive thing. But when we actually think about the driving forces behind that, they're not engaging in that. And do you get where I'm saying?
Yeah,
that,
there's no sense.
Positive,
there's no sense of risk taking or exploration.
Yes, and so it's positive in the sense that great, young men aren't watching porn as much or they're not drinking as much. That's great. But when you think about
what is the motivation behind it,
why they're not doing those things as much, that I know this sounds crazy.
No, I get it. I get it. You can have a bad motivation to actually yield a positive result.
Yeah, I just don't know if I fully buy that. The data, maybe there's some data you could show.
Talk to 20-something-year-old Zoomers.
But that's not quite. That's not really hard factual data.
Remember the Napoleon quote, Tina.
Okay, what I'm looking at here is an 18 to 29-year-old demographic that also reflects. So Gen Z is also reflecting Gen X, just like that other graph.
Yeah.
And so to me, I feel like it's the move to the right.
Part of it is, but I don't think that explains the whole story.
Okay, look, I don't think anybody is saying that one thing or the other thing explains the whole story with respect to that stat.
I understand. I'm just saying Christian is positing something without data to support that portion of what he's saying.
This is one of those things that there's not like a study done on this, but look, if you go on the internet and you go to places like X and you just see 20-something-year-old men talk about their lives, they're not doing stuff. They feel crushed. They have no hope whatsoever. And one of the ways that manifests is a total withdrawal from the rest of the world. Now, at the beginning of that process, you see a bunch of them that go into things like drugs, alcohol, pornography, incredibly self-destructive things that destroy them. But when that continues for 10 years, 15 years, a whole generation, eventually they don't even go to those things to get their hits anymore. They're shutting down. They're totally withdrawing from life.
I get that as a point, and I think there's truth to it. Here's what I will also say. And I'm just going to give an anecdotal.
And I'm not saying the solution is they need to go back to drugs, alcohol, or pornography.
No, I get it. I'm going to give to Tina's point though. I'm going to offer what I think is also a potential explanation. And look, two things can be true at once. You can have some men saying, "I'm not engaging in these things because I've essentially got to the point where I'm so depressed. It's like, what's the point?" Which I think is kind of the point that you're making. I went to an event. Excuse me. I went to an event called Live Action, Young Leaders Summit, and went to it last weekend, or was it the weekend before? Weekend before. And what this is it's a pro-life group, and it's a pro-life group where they talk a lot about the cultural side. So a lot of pro-life organizations exist primarily from like the legislative perspective or things like that. This is one where they focus very, very heavily on the cultural aspect. Like, what are the cultural conditions? Excuse me. What are the cultural conditions which actually foster an environment to where people are more likely to be pro-life? And so they do a lot on the argumentation, and they talk about social conditions, and they talk about families, and they talk about relationships, and they talk about masculinity and femininity, not feminism, femininity, right? All those things. And the first year I went there, which was last year, right? They've been doing this conference 2 years now, right? So I only got 2 data points. But the first year I went there, they had about 800 people show up, and the average age was probably somewhere early to mid 20s. And this is in Southern California. So we're not talking about a bastion of, conservative thought. Thanks, Nate. So 800 people show up, 75% of them were women. 75% of them were young women. Now, that kind of throws against the statistic of, okay, well, why are, if young women are becoming more liberal, why was this predominantly more, women when the Live Action Group is a conservative organization?
There's actually an answer to that.
Well, I know, but that's what I'm getting to is the fact that it was 75% young women. And part of it's because it's the topic of abortion, right? Fast forward 1 year, it goes from 800 people to 1,500 people, and it's 40% male. So it went from 25% attended by young men to 40% attended by young men. So there's a drastic increase in the number of young men that wanted to show up, not just to talk about the pro-life issue, but to talk about this concept of masculinity. What does good masculinity look like? And it was amazing to me, and that's what I was there to speak about. I was there to speak about these concepts of biblical masculinity. And one of the things I pointed out is, hey, to all the men in the audience, we all know why we have problems in this country. It's all your fault. That's right, because you're dumb, stupid, fat, lazy, worthless, and good for nothing. But you've somehow managed to infiltrate every single political, economic, social, and entertainment industry in order to dominate it, in order to hold up the patriarchy against all of the women. So you're too stupid, fat, and lazy to accomplish anything, except, of course, for manipulating all of society to give you advantages at the expense of women. And everyone kind of laughed about that. And I said, but it's a real problem. And we went into the discussions about, okay, so what is a picture of what good, noble masculinity looks like? And these guys didn't just, sit there and listen. They actively engaged. They were the first ones up there to like grab the microphone and be like, okay, well, what about this? Or how do we do this? And then I go outside, like I gave a 30-minute discussion and then I sat on an hour-long panel. And for the rest of the time I was in the hallway outside, I had a line, the entire time, the line never went away, of young men and young women coming up asking about like genuine femininity, genuine masculinity. Young men like, what do I do about this? Or how do I improve that? So I actually think that part of what we're seeing is not just the despair getting the best of young men. I think you're starting to see young men break in one of two directions. So you have one group that is just despair. You have another group that I call collaborators. They're the ones that have decided like, well, maybe if I sign up for doing all the feminism stuff, I'll get to sleep with them once in a while, right? Like that's that group. And then you have the male group that are also the traitors, the collaborators, and they're the men that have been complicit in telling young men that this is what they should be doing, that they should be docile, and that they're toxic, and that they're the problem and everything else, and they need to be totally rejected, right? But then you have a group of men that have said, no, you need to be strong, you need to be powerful, you need to develop all these capabilities intellectually, physically, professionally, right? Why? So you can punish everyone that did this to you. And then you've got another group of men. And these are the groups that I put into like the Jordan Petersons, the John Lovels, the Victor Marks, the Chad Robichaud. They're the ones
seeking out the masculine men to learn from.
They're the ones, so they are seeking out. You have this whole group of men and they're seeking out. They're mad, they're angry, and they know something is wrong with what culture keeps telling them. And they're tending to find voices in one of two areas. The guys that tell them develop it all to take out vengeance and to be strong and powerful and to sleep with as many women as you possibly can and to be rich and everything else. And then they have another group of men that are telling them, you're right, you were lied to. You're right, you were lied to. You were right that what is happening right now is unjust. But the thing to remember is nobody's going to come to save young men because young men are ultimately the ones within society that come to do the saving. And now part of what you have to save is yourselves. And a lot of people don't want to hear that because they're angry, and justifiably so. But they're also the ones that do the saving. Like, this is the part that I want young men to like realize. I'm not saying this to look at you and say, get off your lazy butt, stop playing the video. I'm not saying any of that. I'm saying that the whole reason why this ideology has worked so hard to convince young men that there is no way out, that the best you can ever hope for is sitting in front of your console, and that's it. The reason why they've told you that is because the moment young men start to get something that they actually feel meaning and purpose and a drive toward, this whole charade that they've put up is done. The woke lose no matter who wins. The question now is, who's going to win? And young men are going to have a lot to say about it.
On that front, of course, it's always, we need to worry about the rise of the far right. Here's from one of these articles talking about, again, kind of why young men are moving to the right. They go on to say that, so they're giving examples like, for one thing is, the Me Too movement is one of the things that definitely drove some of them to the right. They go on to say that for young men in particular, social isolation and feelings of alienation are increasingly common experiences that rarely receive constructive discussion. This is why I was trying to bring this up earlier. I don't think nearly enough people are talking about where can I find this that I hinted at earlier? The percentage of adults who say they're saying, just look at this.
That's massive.
There's something horribly wrong that has gone on when 2/3 of the dating and marriage market men say that they're single.
They're checking out.
And yet only 1/3 of women say that. That tells me that a bunch of women think that they've got somebody who actually has 5 women.
Yeah.
Or that they're dating much older.
They could be dating each other
or
as
that
well.
they're dating each other, because when you look at the other thing too that's really crazy is when you look at like sexual orientations, 18 to 29-year-old women, it's like barely a majority of them say that they're straight, which is just a whole nother discussion.
Yeah.
But the point is that like, you have a bunch of men that say they have no friends, they don't have a girlfriend, they don't have a wife, they're stuck at home with their parents. They're not even wasting their lives in the traditional way that men who were broken would waste it, with pornography, drugs, alcohol. They've just totally checked out, right? Like totally checked out. A portion of that group have now been like, oh, no. I know who has done this to me.
Yeah.
And these people are going to get theirs.
Yeah.
And that's the danger right there, Christian, is...
No, that's not the danger. That's the solution.
Hold on.
That's not the danger.
You're not going to agree in just a second. I think we are going to see a rise in the number of women getting attacked by men. And the only reason I say that is because men have been so abused by a feminized society, by even in elementary school. So when I said that 77% of teachers are women, well, 89% of elementary school teachers are women. And so they have received the abuse through the institution for so long, and there is a point where young men will snap. And if they don't turn the right direction on it, if no one's there to guide them, or if the abuse is so atrocious, they are going to turn around and start abusing others, and the target is going to be the people who have abused them. It's going
to be the people that they associate
exactly
with the people,
which will be women.
It goes back to when we did. It was almost 2 years ago when we did our reaction to that video from Rudyard about a right-wing backlash.
Yeah,
it was one of my favorite conversations we ever had. It was also one of our longest. You should go watch it. It's almost 3 hours. And no, there's absolutely going to be a backlash. Like you cannot demonize an entire group of people for their race and their gender, for the crime of existence, who haven't achieved anything yet, for no fault of their own, because they're teenagers or early 20-something-year-olds. They're just entering adulthood. You can't just throw the book at them and basically say these guys are responsible for everything sucking in society. First off, everything doesn't suck in society. Second off, you're going to attack the guys who haven't done anything? Well, and you're going to say they're the ones that are upholding your oppressive patriarchy or whatever? Yeah. What's going to happen is that group is going to turn around and be like, no, it sounds like we actually need some patriarchy.
Well, here's the deal.
And we actually do, by the way.
When a 25-year-old woman who, and again, I'm not saying that if you're a young woman, there's no way that you've dealt with any sort of like bad circumstances, because the other thing we need to remember is young women have been lied to as well. The difference is that
different type of line.
The difference is that they've lied to them by pointing them in a direction and trying to support them in a direction. They've lied to young men by basically saying they suck and they should just sit down and shut up. They've lied to young women by saying you're wonderful and you don't require anything ever, and you don't need a man, and you don't need a family, you don't need kids, you don't need to be perfectly happy and contented. Like, you don't need any of those things. So both have been lied to, but one has been uplifted in the lie while the other has been abused by or like pushed down by the lie. But the other side of that is important is, again, when you're a young man, and the person screaming at you is a young woman for which you know that, to the extent possible, society and the political culture and economic culture and Hollywood has come alongside and said, oh yes, you're the ideal, you're wonderful, you're great, you're brave, you're strong, right? When that person is treating you worse than the person that actually went through difficulties and challenges in life, that actually had to overcome some of the institutional stuff that the 25-year-old talks about but has never really experienced on any significant level. What the young man who is now getting slammed, having done nothing to oppress you, what they start to come to the conclusion is, oh, the problem is the fact that you, like you said, the problem is the fact that you do have all these rights. Because it clearly hasn't made you happy. It clearly has not put you in a position where now you're like, great, now that I have all of these rights, now that I have all of these advantages, I can fully live out what it is to be a strong, empowered woman. No. You're still coming after me. So if the dividend of you getting all of this stuff is you still attack me, then I'm going to come to the conclusion that maybe the problem is you got all this stuff in the first place. That you are going to find young men that come to that logical conclusion. And that's the part where I've made this argument before. I made it on trigonometry. I said, look, you lose no matter what. This is not sustainable. You can't tell young men to do this. The difference is that if you insist on pushing young men down this route, they are going to revolt in a way you really don't like.
This is why, like, I don't think older conservatives fully understand that when young men are moving to the right, they're not moving to Ronald Reagan, Thomas Sowell, traditional conservatism within the Republican Party, tradition in the United States. They're becoming reactionary. And I don't mean this in the sense that, like, when I use the word for myself, I'm not saying they're going out there quoting Donoso Cortez or, de Maistre or something like that. But they're becoming small r, reactionary, in the sense that, like, you talk to younger men, especially younger white men that are like in the 18 to 25-year-old crowd, and they will say things like, no, we need to get rid of the 19th Amendment. No, we need to get rid of the Civil Rights Act. We need to get rid of all of these things. The rallying cry of this group, and to some degree, I actually agree with it, but the rallying cry of this group is, we need to repeal the 20th century.
Yeah.
Now, to a point, I actually agree with that. There's tons of horrible things that came out of the 20th century.
Sure, fascism, communism.
Well, I'm thinking also like income tax, direct election of senators.
Yeah, sure.
But the progressivism came out of the 20th century, and so when they like this is ultimately, I had a friend, good friend of mine. She's in the same age group as me. We both went to college Republicans together. I think we're now getting into the what's going to happen going forward part of this discussion. And she works for the Family Foundation here in Virginia. And she's the same age as me, but she's married. Yeah. And her husband is a great guy, super conservative. He was never a libertarian. But she told me, she was like, Christian, when you and I were in college Republicans, we were all like libertarians. And now we look back in our late 20s and early 30s and we're like, ugh, I had this like libertarian phase. And you kind of have to like apologize and explain about it. And she's like, I look at this like, 18 to 22-year-old crowd, the Zoomer crowd now, and I kind of want to joke with them and be like, you can forgive us and give us, not passes, but you can understand our derpy, cringe libertarian phase, as long as one day you have to own up to your Nazi phase. Or your fascist phase or your whatever phase. And like what she's speaking to is like look at Twitter, for example. Mm-hmm. Now they're not a majority. They're a small, tiny minority, but like there's this huge group of they're all 20-something-year-old guys basically, or teenage guys on Twitter that LARP as Nazis on Twitter. And they're doing it as a form of rebellion against a progressive establishment that just hates them for the crime of being. Well, now, this also manifests in other ways. The same impulse that drives a 21-year-old guy to LARP as a Nazi on Twitter is also the same impulse that drives another 20-something-year-old guy to LARP as a crusader on Twitter.
So here's the deal.
A Roman Empire enjoyer.
I think there's a difference here, because obviously when we use the word LARPing, we use it as a pejorative, right? Like, you're not really serious. You're just doing this live action role play.
Yeah.
I think the difference is that in one manifestation, it can either be a bad form of trolling, right? Like, you've said this before. If you are constantly accusing me of things that I've never done, and it's all my fault, and then you compare me to somebody else, well, then I'm going to start to think, oh, that's my tribe. Well, when the tribe you keep comparing them to is fascist, and they're like, oh, well, I guess they're the fascists then, right? Yeah. I guess that's their team. Well, okay, you certainly don't want to do that if your end state here is to prevent fascism. But then the other side too is people that recognize that, no, I want a higher calling, and I want a higher purpose that goes beyond just economic freedom or licentiousness hiding as liberty. Like, liberty to do what?
That is the positive.
Yes.
So the destructive manifestation of
we
the
have some questions too that we're going to get to.
What I'm trying to get across is that there is a rebellion that's taking place. Yeah. And to your point about, like, some men are looking at this and be like, oh, the problem is we gave you guys, all these left-wing or people that the left have basically indoctrinated in my same age bracket. We gave you guys way too many rights. That's the problem. It's the whole repeal. I shouldn't say it's the whole repeal the 20th century mentality, because that's a whole nother discussion for a whole nother day. But like, that's when you get groups of younger men that are becoming like genuine reactionary. Again, I don't mean that big R, but
I get it. Too many caveats.
But a destructive manifestation of that rebellion is basically the best example I can think of is the Twitter Nazi crowd. That's the destructive, like, no higher guiding principle. It's just, you know what it is? It's you go up to these people that are attacking you, relentlessly attacking you for the crime of being, and you ask them, what is the thing you hate the most about society? And they'll be honest. The left will say Nazis and fascists. And so then the response is, okay, noted. I guess I'm going to go become that thing.
Yeah.
That's the just pure reaction with no higher guiding principle.
Yeah.
The same impulse, though, that's oriented towards a higher guiding principle is how you also get that same crowd that, quote unquote, LARP is something that's not as incredibly self-destructive as the Nazis or fascists. For example, you bring up occasionally that your son talks about how, we need to go like reclaim Constantinople and Jerusalem and go.
We'll joke about like the Crusader era and stuff like that. And
obviously that's a much more, and the left is still going to be horrified at it, but like, I think that's a much more positive conception of masculine Christianity. That's definitely more positive than Mussolini or Hitler.
Yeah.
And so like, do you get where I'm going with this? That like this younger crowd are looking for ways to rebel against the progressive establishment, and they're going in very different directions. But you know what they're not going into? They're not going into, oh shucks, we need to go back to 1980s Reaganism.
Yeah.
That's not what they're going into at all. They're not thinking about, we need to maximize GDP output. Yeah. That's the single most important thing to conserve. That, markets are sacred. No, the sacred is sacred.
Yeah.
And they're looking for that as an output. And so it's a totally different type of it's not even conservatism. It's something else. I say it's just right wing, but that means all sorts of different things. When you say conservative,
is it's conserve what? And that's the big question that we're kind of talking about here is like, what is the thing we want to conserve?
We have a few questions if you guys are willing to answer them.
Yeah.
We've got one from Connor that says, what are some things you've done with Luke that set him up for success as opposed to the cultural norm? What advice, encouragement would you give to young men who want to be upright?
So some of the things that we did with Luke is, we give all of our kids, but specifically with my son, you give him challenges to include like physical and intellectual challenges, projects that they have to work on, things that they've got to figure out. So when they're littler, when they're young, it's all this is age appropriate. So when they're little young, it could be carrying the groceries in, it could be, helping out on a particular project, it could be showing them how to do stuff. But the key is it has to be hard, has to be difficult.
It has to be hard in the right way.
Yes, it's not. And when I mean that, I mean physically and intellectually difficult, challenging, right? Especially with boys too. Like the rough and tumble play stuff when they're little is so important. Like it's so important.
And the mom's instinct is to not let that happen. And it's hard because you've got like any women listening who have the same question about their sons. You have to make sure you don't emasculate your son unintentionally.
Yeah. And one of the ways you do that too is don't emasculate your husband.
That's
because
true.
Kids are watching that. If you're emasculating your husband, you're teaching your son a lesson you don't want taught. And you're not going to like the response you get from your husband either. But the whole rough and tumble thing, the playing, the rough housing with boys, the encouragement, like when your boy gets hurt or something like that, it's not rushing over. And now obviously, like if you got to rush him to the hospital, that's different. But I'm saying like the falling down, scraping your knees and whatnot, I'd be like, hey, get up, dry up. No, you don't need to cry over that. Like a lot of people now treat that as like, oh, you're being mean or you're teaching your little boy they can't cry. Like, no, I'm teaching my little boy that you have to be able to suck it up, do your job, get things done, and not let your emotions or pain or circumstances control the way that you look at the environment that you're in. You can't do that because it's not going to serve you well, and it certainly isn't going to serve the people you care about well. So a lot of it is about creating those challenges, age-appropriate challenges, and as they get older, the challenges get more difficult. So when my son was little, I'd be like, hey, do this. I'm going to show you how. When they get older, I would have given Luke a project. It could be something simple like, hey, the chickens keep getting out, fix it. How do you want me to do that? I don't care. Just fix it. Well, now I'm not just creating a physical challenge with respect to fixing a problem. I'm forcing him to come up with solutions based off of things like available resources, time constraints, and things like that. And so all of those things are important, but the number one most important thing, and I cannot emphasize this enough, and this is always where the secular crowd gets mad at me, is faith in God. Like that had to be the foundation of everything else, because it's that faith, it's that relationship and faith in Christ that provided the objective moral order and standard for right and wrong. So now all of a sudden things are not just do this because I said so, or even just do it because you like it. It's like, no, we do things in service to a noble purpose. And and again, there are things throughout our lives that also add to that. So when you're very little, it could be family. It's like, hey, family is important, and we do things in service to something that's noble, and that's taking care of our family or contributing or being a part of the family. And then, later on, if you get married, it's like, now I'm a husband and I have an obligation to my wife, which again, I demonstrate these things by how I treat Tina. Or it's I have children, and these are the things that you do for your children. And so all of these things end up becoming noble purposes that gives you the meaning in order to face challenges and overcome them and do better, right? Like that's what's so important. It's one of the reasons why it's dangerous when you have a whole group of young men that have essentially said, I'm single and I'm not interested in getting married. It is because there is a civilizing influence that happens with respect to men's desire to be powerful and competitive when that is in service to taking care of their wife or their kids or their family. There's now a noble drive toward those instincts.
Deeper purpose.
A deeper purpose. And so that was one of the things that I did is we inculcated, and this is the other thing too, to Tina's point about it's not just about what the father does for the son, although that's absolutely critical. One of the biggest compliments that I give, to Tina is if you asked all three of my kids what they wanted to do, they all want to get married young and they all want to have kids young. Why? Because they want to replicate the sort of environment they grew up in. Right now, I have to give Tina the lion's share of the credit for that. Because I was deployed a lot. I was gone a lot. I was doing other things that I had to do either for work or because I got deployed to war, right? But it's this idea that there was this environment created that they looked at and said, I want to replicate that. And now I know the things I have to do in order to get it. And so those are, I hope that answers your question, but those are some of the things that.
This is a hard thing to do too, because even within our side of the political spectrum, you would think women would be like, yes, a little more traditional, a little more, but a lot of times what you run into is women who still want all of their autonomy. They still want all of their feminism. And that's what they are going to heap on this poor man that just wants a wife that's going to give him what he's giving her. And once you get married, there is no autonomy. And the idea that on either side, and the idea that a woman wants to be able to go, well, I still want all of my own things, but I want you, and I don't need you. Yeah. I want you. And it's like, no. We need to make sure they know we do need them. They need, we're needed, and that's a good thing. And he's needed too. Let's not try to lord this weird thing over each other. And I think that it has festered itself and permeated within our side of the political spectrum as well.
Well, and let me say this. It's not just about what I've trained my son. It's also about what I've trained my daughters. Right. And that goes to Tina's point. We never taught our children, we never taught our daughters that you don't need no man. We never taught our son that you don't need no woman. We didn't teach them that. And we didn't teach them that they were in competition with one another, that one day they'd be in competition with their future spouse. We taught them complementary roles, which is taboo right now. Well, where did we get that? The Bible. Mm-hmm. You read Proverbs 31, that's not a weak woman, but it's also not a woman that don't need no man.
Yeah, and there's women who are kind of deconstructing Christianity in order to bring feminism into all of that as well. We could do an entire other podcast.
Yeah, can we? Because this is a podcast about young men, not young women.
Okay, but it's young men being abused by women.
Let me ask you something. You want to find a wife, right? And you're really frustrated by the fact that 70% of women are doing this. You know who's not doing this? You know who doesn't fall into any of these categories? The daughters we raised. And the reason why I bring it up is because you're right. I do want to focus on young men and I want to give them some hope. And I also want people out there to know that one of the ways that you actually save young men is don't raise your daughters to be leftist feminists.
Yeah.
That much is very true.
Please, let's present these young men with women that are actually worthy. You know, and this idea that women don't have to be worthy, blah, 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 we're all perfect. That's not true. Raise your women to value men. Yeah. Raise young women to value men, and then the men will be able to reap some benefit. But until we can actually do that and start valuing men again, like the future looks dire if we can't turn the tide.
The reason I got upset there for a moment is because to me, it feels like that we cannot have I'm speaking rhetorically. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying just this podcast, but to me, it feels like, and it's part of the reason I wanted to do this podcast, that we cannot have a conversation about young men without bringing in a whole bunch of other groups and talking about other groups. And that's my whole point. Nobody wants to talk about just young men. Yeah. What's happening with them? Why is it happening? And what they can do about it. Instead, it's whenever we talk about it, we also have to bring up women. We also have to bring up,
but okay, I don't disagree with you, but in the context we're talking about it here, we're talking about it like, hey, young women, you've got some work to do as well in order to help repair what has actually been done to young men.
And I don't
that's
disagree.
An appropriate context.
I don't disagree, but I'm thinking like young men cannot fix the problem that has happened to their sisters. Because it was their parents that raised them.
Okay, Christian, where the disconnect is we were asked a question about what we taught Luke in order to be able to overcome some of these things. So we were answering that question, and this came up in the process of answering that question.
I get that. I'm just, look, here's the issue. I think we all kind of know, and when you and I talked about this podcast and we had a conversation about this, you said something at the very end of that conversation that I think really resonated with myself and Hamilton, who was listening too. That like, look, we can't just sell them more despair because all the data is there. Like all the data is very clear that young men are very depressed. They feel very aimless. They have no direction. They're under constant attack and assault. They have no advancement career but like diminishing opportunities for career advancement, diminishing opportunities for marriage and children and having, moving out of their parents' house. It's a very bleak picture at the moment. We can't just be selling them more despair. We need to be directing them in a positive direction. And in some cases, leading them, because a lot of these young men are looking for leadership. That's another thing that's driving a lot of the LARPing in different directions. Yeah. It's aspiring to leadership. And that can be, you can get very different outcomes from that. It goes back to the old point that you and I have tried to bring up before, that look, hierarchy is inevitable.
Yeah.
The question is what hierarchy is going to look like.
Yeah.
Right? Because there's very positive manifestations of hierarchy and there's very destructive, negative manifestations of hierarchy that have existed in history as well. But the underlying trend is that you're always going to get a hierarchy. I think a lot of these young men, they want a hierarchy. They want a leader that they can rally behind and direct them towards something. And who that leader is and to what purpose and what end, those are very different outcomes.
Well, so to that point, like if I was going to just give,
but it's going to require revolting against the current system.
If I was going to give advice to young men right now, it would be this: this is a corrupt system and it needs to be broken. Right?
Not reformed.
Not reformed, broken. It needs to be broken so that we can actually get to the system that works. And the system that works, in my mind, whether you want to adopt my faith or not, but that biblical worldview of men have a strong, important role to play as leaders, as brave, as providers, as protectors, as all of those things. And part of the reason why they develop those capabilities is so that you can have the sort of society where both genuine masculinity and genuine femininity can flourish. Because now it's working in cooperation with one another. And by the way, young men, for all of the other men who lied to you about this, they're traitors, right? They're traitors. Step one, stop listening to them. If they ever had your best interest in mind, if you ever thought they had, they clearly do not, right? That needs to be broken. The other thing too is I think sometimes young men will look around and be like, wait a second, I am punished for actually trying to develop these masculine traits. To that I would respond, yes. but you have to do it anyways because that's what you're breaking. Right? That's what it is. It's the way you break this hold that we have in our culture right now is when all the feminists and all the leftists and all of them get up there and are screaming at you for doing this. And you look back at them and be like, and what are you going to do about it? Because the answer ultimately is not as much as they would like to, because they can't. Why? Because you're the ones we use to fight wars, police streets, fight fires, and everything else. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying there's not going to be any pain. There is no pathway through this without pain. But here's the good news. You win the moment you decide that you are going to win, that you are going to fight through this. I gave this discussion to Luke right before he went off to infantry basic training. And I would say, son, look, you name the school. I've been to a lot of them, right? And I'm not saying all this is trying to do like a list of accomplishments. I'm just trying to make a point, right? I've been to Ranger, I've been to infantry, I've been to airborne, I've been to basic, I've been to special forces, I've been to a lot of other ones, and I saw people quit. I saw people fail. More fail than make it. And what I remember telling Luke was the difference is I wasn't stronger, I wasn't smarter than a lot of the people that made it through. The difference is that me and the guys that really made it, we had made up our minds, we're not coming home without it. We're not losing. And that's the part that's so critical about this. It's about making up in your mind, no, I don't lose this at the end. You do. I win. And if there's a setback, I'm going to get right back up and I'll be coming again, because what I want you to understand is no matter what you do, I'm not stopping. I'm coming for this because I know in my heart, I know in my mind that it's true, that there is something true and wonderful about the way that God created men and women to support, help, and thrive together, and you've tried to rob me of it. And so I'm taking it back. And I know I'm going to win because I look throughout all of human history. And what happens is when good, noble men decide to bind together to no longer put up with this crap and take it back, they win. And so that's what I want them to understand. Is that the bad news we got to fight for something we shouldn't have to fight for. It should be so painfully obvious to all of us that it shouldn't even require this level of effort to achieve. The good news is that once you've decided that you are absolutely dedicated to achieving it, you will over time. And the difference is that once you've done it, especially if we do it for the good and the noble purposes that I've been talking about, once you've done it, then you will then usher in an era to where your sons and your daughters will never have to fight through the same crap that you did. You will have been the ones to have changed the entire trajectory of generations because you stood up in this moment. But that's the only way through it, is you standing up in the moment. Nobody's coming to save you because you're the ones that save people.
I'm like sitting here across the table. I want to be like, Ave Freitas. Imperator. I feel like the Roman legionaries that are like ready to proclaim a new emperor right now. Like that what you just said right there in the last like 2 or 3 minutes is what I was waiting for in this entire podcast. And was like earlier I was like making sniping remarks and stuff like that because I was trying to pull that out. That what you just said is the answer to the problem. Like seriously, and I'm not just trying to gas you up here, but like that is the answer to the problem. And by the way, that's the answer to the secondary problem, which is men going the wrong route.
Yeah.
Because you're not saying, oh, toughen up. You're not giving the typical boomer response. Just toughen up, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Yeah. Just try harder. And you're definitely not giving the blue-pilled response. Just be a feminist.
Yeah.
Right? Just buy into the system. Just let them beat you over the head for your identity. No, you're saying, the system is evil, it's corrupted, and it's going to get overthrown. We need to overthrow it. And by the way, we need to build something better once we do so. I think there's millions, maybe tens of millions of young men out there in this country and definitely in other countries based on the data that we've seen. They're waiting for a leader to point that out and to give them that vision. What we want is obviously a positive leader.
Yeah.
We want somebody to direct them towards something that's going to be building civilization, not deconstructing civilization. Because there's multiple ways you can deconstruct civilization. There's the left-wing way that we've seen, and there's the 20th century way that our grandparents and great-grandparents lived through. But we don't have to choose between those. That's a false dichotomy.
Yeah.
We don't have to choose between that. There's a positive way, which is the vast majority of human history. How do you build civilization? It's through strong men.
Yeah.
It's through positive hierarchy.
Yeah.
And it's through It's through strong men and a positive hierarchy oriented towards the good, oriented to something that's greater than just men.
Yeah.
It's not the Nietzschean will to power. That's not to say that you don't use power. In fact, actually, the lie, I think, is that you have to use it. You have to claim power. It's a will to power, not for power's sake. It's a will to power for something that's so much higher than power, that's not just man-made. It's not, I mean, that's all corruptible. It's towards something that's eternal and true and divinely inspired.
Yeah.
That it's towards God-given ends. That is the positive manifestation of all of these traits that I think men are looking for. They're looking for hierarchy. They're looking for order. They're looking for strength. They're looking for masculinity. And everything you just articulated right there is taking all of that stuff and orienting it towards the good.
Yeah.
Because when you and I have these conversations, I've brought up before that this is unspoken all too often, but it needs to be brought up more often. Is that, you can look at the tragedies of the 20th century as, tyranny versus liberty, liberalism fighting against fascism and communism and defeating both of them. Well, first monarchy, right? And defeating all three of them. And we have this like conception, especially with World War II being this, it's not a typical war, right? It's not just between great powers. It's an ideological struggle, right? It's almost like it's between good and evil. Leave out the fact that, the Marxists win in the East, but we win in the West, right? And so we look at it from a very moralistic lens, and it makes sense, right? When you think about how destructive it was and how many people it killed and how many genocides it unleashed and how it was driven by ideologies that had this almost religious impulse to them. But when you look at the underlying factors that drove the behaviors of the Nazi and fascist regimes in Europe in the 1930s and 40s, you can draw things out from them that lead to incredibly destructive ends. But when you actually look at what motivated people to fall into them, what did they have in common? They weren't woke. Yeah. They weren't progressive. Yeah. They did not espouse, DEI and anything like that. Like they were, Hitler and Mussolini, their regimes were talking about masculinity, strength, order, conquest. They made no excuses for those things. They were going out there and saying, no, you are going to conquer the world. You are the supermen or whatever, the Nietzschean Ubermensch. And look at what they did. Look at what they unleashed. It was the unraveling of civilization. They destroyed Europe. They killed tens of millions of people. And ultimately, they destroyed the very countries that adopted these ideologies. Nobody suffered more from the rise of Nazism than Germany itself. The German nation was obliterated and then split in two for 40 years. But you know what? The things that they were pointing to was to destructive ends. But the real corruption was that they were using things that are essential to civilization, but are detached from any moral bearing. Yeah, they try to become gods themselves. They try to become gods themselves, and that's the dangerous thing: is that masculinity is essential to civilization, but when it's detached from a moral compass, it can be incredible. It's like fire. Yeah, fire is essential to life, but it can burn your house down. Yeah. And so the response is, well, we're going to put out all the fires in the world. That's the progressive liberal response. We're going to put out all the fires in the world. Yeah. We're going to eliminate masculinity. We're going to eliminate nationalism. We're going to eliminate any order, any hierarchy, any of those things. And the actual response, actual true conservative response is not conserve GDP. It's, no, we're going to revive these things towards positive ends. Yeah. Not civilizational destructive ends, but actual civilizationally building ends, because it's not going to be man-made of what those ends are. That's what the Nazis did. Yeah. There's no appeal to a higher order. And what we want is a Christian-oriented, something that's eternal, not man-made, and saying, no, we're going to reclaim these things and we're going to build civilization from it rather than deconstruct it. And I think nobody has been speaking to that for a century. Yeah. No, I think you're right. Because here's the problem. We've got a lot of people that have tried to get their identity from 1,000 different places that will never give them ultimate meaning and purpose. And this is where I go back to, because people have asked me before when I announced I was retiring from the House of Delegates, and, how do you feel about it? I said, I feel fine. Like, why? It's not my identity. I think it was an important role, but it's not my identity. My identity is in Christ first. And then my identity is derived from things like being a husband, being a father, doing these other things, which provides noble purpose, but also objective standards. It's also
it's also regulating in the sense that it tells me I'm not allowed to use power, influence for ignoble ends. I'm not allowed to do that because it's not only destructive of me, it's destructive of the things that I love. It's destructive of the things that I hold up. And so I think so much of what we're talking about when we discuss what direction do we want young men to go, it has to start with, where do you get your identity? Because wherever you get your identity from, I can tell you what the future looks like for you.
Yes.
Because you are either going to develop those necessary traits spiritually, emotionally, intellectually, physically, professionally, in service to something good and noble, or you're going to do it to something that's ultimately destructive and empty. And that's where we're at. I mean, the good news is I think we've got more and more people that are willing to step into that role and actually say, no, everything you've been told about this toxic masculinity crap, about leftism, it is a lie. Here's the truth. Because for too long we've been like, well, you have your opinion, that's your good idea, and this is your worldview, and this one's over here, and let's treat them all like they're equal. No, I think this one's true, which means I think the ones that contradict it are a lie. And so the best thing I can do is tell you what I believe to be true. Now, you're still free to make your own decision. But I am going to defend what I believe is true with the same passion and intensity that everybody else who's been telling lies to civilization have done. And so that's what I start to see on the rise right now. It's the reemergence of people going, nope, this is true. And I'm going to defend it as such.
And that's how you pull all these young men off the couch.
Yeah.
And you get them to actually do something, not just for political ends, but ultimately for civilizational ends. Like, this is how that mentality that you just articulated is how you fix the dating crisis and the marriage crisis and the birth rate crisis and the crisis of modernity in general. And by the way, this is also how you protect all the other things that modern conservatives want to protect, which includes things like property rights and free markets and stuff like that. Because again, it's all oriented towards a long-term positive vision. But we've got to reclaim those original roots. And I think that, oh man, I'm just so happy. I feel like there's like this breakthrough that has been like years in the making that just took place at the very end there. So I'm sorry for rambling at the end, but I'm just sitting here like, oh my gosh, I've been down this path for a couple of years, and you've been down this path too, but like we've kind of been in parallel tracks, and I feel like for the first time in a while, we just like reconnected.
Yeah. Well, listen, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Christian, all the research on this, Tina as well. And thank you, the audience, for sticking with us. We know we went a little bit long, but look, we think it's an incredibly important topic, and one that is, even when it gets attention, it's usually the wrong kind. Right? It's usually this idea of, oh, young men are not doing what we want them to do. What's the problem with young men? Instead of saying, have you actually bothered listening to young men and what they have to say about this? And ultimately, I think the solution is there. And I am increasingly encouraged to see more and more people willing to pick it up, actually declare the truth to be the truth, unapologetically, boldly, and actually providing a mechanism where other young men can follow, and certainly an alternative to what they've been given so far. And that's been one of the things that we will continue to try to do through this program and through all of our efforts in our community. By the way, if you are interested in joining our community, because there are a lot of other things that we do, go ahead and look at the link in the description. We have some additional programming that we do exclusively for our committee. If you want to play more of an active role on asking questions throughout the show and actually helping us determine what shows we'll do, joining that community is a great way to not only support what we do, but to play a larger role in it and as well. And based off of some of the questions we're getting here, I might have some ideas for some future programming that we're going to be doing, maybe on the mentorship side and on the education side. So once again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next episode.